Well, thank you everyone for joining our webinar here at Peer about AI pilots in medical writing. I'm thrilled to be joined by Catherine Campbell from 4D Molecular Therapeutics for this webinar today. Just as some housekeeping, you should see an option at the bottom for Q&A. If there's any questions, we'll try to go through it as we go or at the end. So please put any questions in there. And we also will be recording this webinar as well to reference later. So with that, we'll jump in. I want to start with just some quick introductions here. So my name is Anita Modi. I'm the founder and CEO here at Pure AI. I'll share a little bit more about Pure AI shortly, but we started the company about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I spent about 2 decades building technology specifically in this industry, most recently serving as the Chief Quality Officer at a company called Science 37 in the decentralized trial space, where I worked with regulatory leaders across biotech and pharma, all the way from starting pilots, which is going to be the core of our conversation today, and really scaling into production as well. But those experiences are what led me and the team here to start Peer just about 3 years ago. Catherine, I'll pass it to you.
Yes, hi. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me, Anita. My name is Catherine Campbell. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory and Quality at 4D Molecular Therapeutics. I've been in the industry for about 20 years, and I'm looking forward to this discussion with you today. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, very quickly, background about Pure AI before you jump in, so everyone has some context. As I mentioned, we started the company about 3 years ago, really with the advent of generative AI and what's now known as agentic AI. This is a company and a product built by regulatory experts. Our founding team comes from places like Vertex and Viva, PPD, Syneos, and more, and is joined by an entire engineering team led by folks from Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and others as well. And we brought this expertise together from day one to really think about what does a solution around regulatory submission documentation look like. The platform that we've built here has been used for drafting regulatory documents all the way from the preclinical and CMC side through clinical, and is designed with an entire interface for regulatory experts to interact with agentic AI across the workflow as well. It's been such a privilege over the last 3 years to work with companies from mid-sized biotech all the way through larger pharma across many of these use cases. And I think really seen the value that AI can bring across speed when we look at reduction in drafting time, but really in quality, which is what a lot of our talk today will focus on. We'll spend some time talking about how you actually look at quality when you're, talking about AI-generated content. But it's been an incredible journey the last 3 years. If you're interested in a demo or learning more about Pure AI, please reach out to me or navigate to our website, www.getpeer.ai. With that, I want to shift to kind of the main focus of today, which is the P word, pilots. I think anyone who's worked in sort of innovation and life sciences is familiar with that term, and especially as we're all kind of on a frontier of AI adoption, the role that pilots have played in our industry. We want to focus today on kind of what it means to go beyond the pilot and what some of those factors around success ultimately look like. So the way we'll kind of approach that today is by talking about some of the patterns that we at Pure AI have seen on why pilots actually stall. Catherine will share some of their framework at 4DMT on pilot readiness and pilot evaluation. And then we'll share kind of our perspectives on what successful and scaled implementations ultimately have in common. We'd love for this to be more of an open discussion, so please use the Q&A, use the chat to share your perspectives as we all continue to learn on this frontier. So let's jump in. Here at Peer over the last 3 years, we've obviously worked with companies around a piloting stage. We are big believers in the pilot. We think, right now when AI is so new to many of the workflows, many of the companies, it is important to start to understand what AI can mean for your organization, and how to start to benchmark what that looks like in terms of value in multiple time horizons as well. But there are many reasons that pilots tend to stall, and I think it's really important to ultimately design for pilots in the right way that makes sense for your organization. I'll share a little bit more about all of these, but some of the themes that we see are workflow misalignment, so using pilots to look at tools based on capability, but not necessarily workflow fit. Institutional knowledge gaps, surfacing gaps in kind of knowledge and how that's ultimately built in. Looking at the wrong metrics to determine pilot success. I know Catherine's going to talk a lot about the really kind of robust framework for DMT used, but often looking at things like speed versus holistically looking at many other metrics here. And then fourth being cognitive restructuring demand. So why writers resist, what makes these pilots sort of stall, and how to prevent, perhaps for the wrong reasons, moving into production. So let's jump into each of these. The first is around workflow misalignment. So the tool being evaluated on what it could do, but not necessarily how it fits into how writers or teams truly operate. The key aspect we sometimes see here is what is a writer or a team ultimately doing with generated content? If they are still verifying every single sentence in generated content against source documents, we actually haven't changed the workflow. In fact, all we've done is add a step here. And so it's really important, as we think about what is the workflow with AI, post AI, and are we evaluating a pilot around that alignment? And what we've seen that when it doesn't happen or it's misaligned around as part of the evaluation process, the speed gains that are ultimately being evaluated and measured here disappeared. And worse, we've seen writers and users ultimately disengage because you're actually creating a step versus thinking holistically about workflow, what workflow should look like. The second reason is about institutional knowledge gaps. I think everyone in this seat knows that medical writing isn't just about text production. It's truly a reflection of accumulated judgment by an organization based on the history of their experience. This can look like a lot of different things. Most obviously, it's compound specific history and clinical positioning. So, that history, the detail, the conversations that are specific to your compound, specific to your organization. Often at the point that we're working with companies, they know heavily around, their engagement with regulators, agency reviewer preferences, and that may not necessarily be captured somewhere. It's really accumulated judgment on what makes sense as they think about ultimately various regulatory submissions. We here at Peer have worked across therapeutic areas, and we know that there are conventions specific to that therapeutic area. Again, accumulated judgment that comes over time working in this specific domain. And this one is probably the closest to many of our hearts, internal reviewer sensitivities. Every organization looks so different. We know all of these documents are so cross-functional, and often there are sensitivities by various stakeholders, all for good reasons, that need to be reflected in how writing is done. So it's not just text production, it's really accumulation of this type of judgment. And what we found, especially in sort of pilots, is that AI tools trained on more generic data will surface this gap the moment that complexity and that sort of accumulated judgment needs to be represented. And it's really important to think about that even in a pilot design. All right, wrong metrics. I think from the moment AI started to be part of our conversation, it was synonymous with speed. Now, the issue that we've seen in pilot evaluations is often there's over-indexing in speed. We've seen pilots designed where it's solely measured on time. So, what is the time to the first draft? What is turnaround time reduction? We've seen companies, asked to measure on the number of pages authored, or in one case, even paragraphs authored per document. And while these are all important, they're metrics that show the work that's being done. Our view here at Peer is that it's equally important to think about the aspects outside of speed. So, in cases that we've seen pilots stall, it's because things that were not measured were writer trust in the output, which is really a reflection of the quality, reviewer acceptance of AI assistant documents. What happens actually if they start to get downstream? And what does that downstream quality actually look like from a measurable perspective, as well as scalability? So, again, if you think about the pilot as one moment in time to really benchmark for your organization, how are you measuring what that looks like at scale? We've seen cases now where, when trust problems ultimately emerged later, they were attributed to the tool, but not necessarily the evaluation design. So there wasn't as much emphasis on quality or scale as much as the time. And finally, the fourth aspect here I want to highlight is around cognitive restructuring demand. So, tools that ultimately change how writers think. We know, kind of being an operators in this space for the last few years, that there's some tools that ask writers and teams to restructure their entire cognitive approach to think with AI from the start. And when that happens and pilots are faced with resistance, the assumption becomes, well, writers are resisting because they're change averse. When in reality, writers are resisting because they're right to protect that expert judgment and how their kind of cognitive process works today, all for good reason, going back to sort of that accumulated judgment. And so I think what we've seen work, and again, pilots that are structured around this ultimately scale into production, is when it's really about meeting writers where they are. So embedding AI in their cognition, not replacing it, and really thinking again, how does that expert and how does that AI work together in a workflow to ultimately get to kind of the best placed, fastest as well. So those are some of the reasons that we've seen across our experience the last 3 years on why pilots haven't necessarily progressed. And the theme here is they aren't failures of adoption. They really end up being kind of failures of design. And the theme that we've seen, I'll come back to this a little bit at the end, is that organizations that were able to get past the pilot stage, it wasn't that they had better writers or, more expertise or better technology. It was really that they entered kind of the pilot phase designing for that integration and designing for kind of a production a little bit differently. It really was about design and intentional design from the start. And I'll say, I think one of my favorite examples of sort of being very intentional around pilot readiness is the experience that we've, seen with 4D Molecular Therapeutics. And so I wanted to turn it over to Catherine to share their experience.
Thank you, Anita. Appreciate it. So today I'll walk you through our experience that we had at 4DMT evaluating an AI solution for our company. So first of all, I'll talk about the key drivers that enable the successful AI pilot readiness. The initiative was anchored in solving a critical business need and a simple goal, accelerating BLA submission timeline despite having no medical writing group in-house. The success was supported by strong executive and cross-functional endorsement, along with the necessary financial investment, the infrastructure to integrate AI into our existing systems, and then importantly, a champion to lead the implementation. Finally, the value proposition, was clearly demonstrated through substantial time and cost savings while maintaining comparable quality and enabling scalability. So this slide describes the evaluation process at a high level that we use to identify vendors and evaluate the AI-generated outputs. We initially identified 10 vendors that had out-of-the-box capabilities that were suitable for our purposes. We interviewed each vendor, attended live demonstrations, conducted capability assessments. From this group of 10 vendors, we narrowed it down to 4 for a pilot trial in which we evaluated AI-generated CSRs, so clinical study reports, against a human-generated clinical study report. Next. So the pilot trial consisted of the following workflow. First, we shared and uploaded our documents. These were the source documents like the protocol, the statistical analysis plan, and the TLFs, tables, listings, and figures. The AI agent generated the first draft CSR, which was generally verified by the agent. The last step, which was critical to our evaluation of these 4 vendors, was the human review, and I'll describe this in more detail in the next few slides. So this is the step at which we did a comprehensive evaluation of the AI-generated output. The evaluation was the most time-consuming part of the process, but it was the most important in our final decision. We conducted a thorough assessment of each AI-generated CSR against more than 50 qualitative and quantitative performance metrics, including accuracy, completeness, readability, consistency, etc. The evaluation was conducted by a cross-functional team spanning regulatory, clinical sciences, and quality assurance to ensure an unbiased and balanced assessment. This snapshot here, this little table, is just a snapshot of our evaluation and ranking criteria. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you the results of our thorough evaluation. So these are interesting because we provided the same exact input to each of the AI systems, and the output was sometimes similar, but sometimes substantially different. At the end of the day, we selected the vendor that had the best quality output and that would meet our accelerated deliverable timelines. And that was Peer AI. Next. And there are limitations to AI. So here's a side-by-side example of conclusions generated by two separate AI vendors. And I'll remind you that the inputs were exactly the same. So you can see here in CSR number 1 that the agent highlighted a high frequency of ocular and systemic adverse events, a progressive decline in all cohorts, no evidence of dose-dependent improvement, versus the CSR generated by the second agent, which took a much more muted or neutral language. And this was actually more in line with our conclusions because the CSR generated was a small phase 1 clinical trial in a patient population that has no alternative treatments. And so this is, yeah, next slide. Yeah, thank you. So I'll talk about how, having human in the loop is so critical. Where the AI agent can contribute to the execution, the speed, the automation, and the scalability, the human intervention is critical in providing judgment, interpretation, key messaging, and decision making. And you could see that from the examples that I gave in the previous slide, where the output, the interpretation is so critical. Next slide, I'll talk about our project timeline. So overall, this project took about 8 months for completion from kickoff to vendor selection. We probably could have gone faster with more dedicated internal resources. But at the end of the day, I think this still was much faster and much cheaper than developing a custom in-house AI solution. And finally, I'll end with a few lessons learned from our experience here at 4D. First and foremost, the project needs a champion who will lead the due diligence efforts and drive execution. This is so important. Early engagement with the executive teams and cross-functional teams is also critical. I think it's important to involve key stakeholders from the beginning. So having medical writers, clinical sciences, regulatory, quality assurance, all included from the initial assessment was really helpful in our situation. And finally, taking a long-term view to ensure that there's a workflow fit and establish internal governance around the use of AI to enable a smooth integration. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. I think I'll
Yes.
I'll reflect that all of these aspects of the lessons learned were so clear to us when we started to first engage that I remember Catherine, you said, um, speed, well, we know AI will be fast, but how do you really think about quality? How do we think about what this will mean for our, you know, cross-functional team as well? And really starting to bring that both in the discussions, but also the kind of evaluation criteria from the start. Wonderful. Well, with that, I want to reflect a little bit about, shared a little thoughts on why sometimes we've seen pilots fail or stall and not necessarily move forward, but then what the implementations that worked had in common. And I think this rolls up many of the things that Catherine shared as well. I think the four conditions we've seen across the board in successful cases of scale up first has been around change management. So it is no surprise that AI is a change. Even in the easiest to use tools, it is still a workflow change. And what we've seen is that change management preceded deployment. It was part of the conversation from day one. What does this mean for our process? What does this mean for our team? And having writers and anyone who'd be part of this process involved in the design, not just training after the decision has been made. We've seen that conversations that start and are grounded in change management are one of the key things that lead to kind of pilots, resulting in scale. The second is that, quality validation is built into the pilot. I think you saw Catherine in the 4DMT's evaluation framework. It is so many ways to look at quality. And it's not just, again, is it faster, but can we maintain regulatory quality as we progress? And I'll say this is something that's been core to our thinking here at Peer from day one. How do you measure quality in something that often feels like it could be subjective? And can you start to actually measure it and bring, quantitative framework around it? The third is someone owning that integration layer. So someone owning not just, what does this mean in our workflow, but how does this ultimately fit into how our workflow will continue to evolve and how our team will continue to evolve? In many organizations, for example, we see efforts around training of writers around just AI in general, adaptation of kind of SOPs, and actually having someone who owns that integration layer, understands tooling capabilities and how that fits has been, critical for ultimately scaling up and deployment. And I'll say that's the last aspect. So writers co-owning kind of the knowledge and the rollout. We talked a little bit about institutional knowledge, but treating that as a team asset and a company asset. So co-designing what deployment looks like, again, as kind of an organizational change project. And so all of this points to, we here as technology builders know that the technology selection is important, but really, if we step back, the transition from pilot to production depends more on change management at the end of the day and ensuring that technology selection fits into that model of organizational change management. One of the things we up here have talked a lot about and sort of socialized and helped our customers with is a framework around assessing maturity. And this is not necessarily kind of a score, but it's a language or a way to kind of assess AI readiness. We ultimately look at four dimensions around readiness and maturity, and we think it's important to have these conversations even at a pilot stage. The first is workflow integration depth. So, is AI sitting at the edges of this workflow or deeply embedded within it? It's okay to start in one place and evolve, but what does that look like, whether it's pilot to, crawl, walk, running? What does that ultimately look like in terms of depth? Second, and I'll say maybe to me, this is probably the most critical, are your writers and team using these tools because they want to and they see the value, or is this something that's being mandated? They have to do it. Um, I think the trust and the engagement at every level, in my mind, is critical for AI readiness and for AI adoption. And it's important to kind of bring that voice and that theme into conversations even at a pilot phase. The third, we talked about what does the maturity look like in terms of quality validation? Is there explicit criteria for AI assisted output that can be defended within a company, to a reviewer, across a team? And even as you tend to grow, across use cases and across the organization as well. We here at Peer have thought a lot about this and have, our own framework. We actually just released a paper in the AmWad Journal last week about our view on quality and how to start to measure that. And we think this is one of the most critical things that's necessary for AI readiness. More than anything, it gives kind of a common language that allows everyone at the organization to talk about quality hand in hand with speed. And then again, change management investment. And a lot of this can be assessed based on who's involved at what point. So, are you looking at the deployment as a tech rollout, very similar to other technology solutions that you've had before, or around organizational change? In which case, you're not just talking about the technology, but again, you're talking about people and process and a journey to ultimately get to that end state. So, we found this framework to really be helpful, even at a pilot phase, as we talk about AI readiness and maturing into production as well. So with that, our guidance here, as many of you are looking at, both pilots and scaling, is to do a few different things within your organization next week. The first is having a conversation with the implementation team and your AI vendor, but really all those involved in any deployment here about, again, this aspect of are you changing your workflow or how are you fitting into existing workflows? It's okay to change workflows as long as it's a very intentional discussion around how things fit together. The second is that internal conversation on quality. So, asking your QA lead, your cross-functional partners, what does acceptable AI assisted output look like? And how are we going to continuously measure that? Not just in a pilot, but as we continue to go, bringing in AI. And then we really think this is a helpful exercise, but asking your writers, and this is something we've seen organizations get, on a whiteboard and look at old submissions, but say, what parts of this process would you trust with AI and what would you not do? And I think looking at previous projects, previous submissions, and actually breaking this down into columns on a whiteboard has been a really good exercise to one, get, everyone at your organization aligned around what can AI do and not do, but also start to reframe the conversation around where can you start to see the most value with AI in your workflow over time. So for us, just a reminder, the pilot isn't the destination. I think we often talk a lot about it as it's one piece, but it really is the start. Um, and I think we here at Peer, especially over the last 3 years, we've recognized that the pilot phase is a comfortable place. It's lower stakes, it's easier to walk back. It feels like progress without having to make really hard commitments. Um, but I think seeing how quickly our industry is evolving, the window for kind of using that time and that pilot phase is closing, and we're seeing that organizations quickly moving past that and scaling intentionally or starting to see that compounding advantage. We've now worked with customers where they're seeing document over document value, both in quality and time, because they were able to start and very intentionally scale quickly from all aspects of technology and change management as well. And so I'll leave you with kind of the close, which for me, the question isn't whether AI will work. It's whether your organization is sort of building the conditions for it to work. And even at the pilot phase, we think that's really critical to evaluate to ensure that you scale from there. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And if there's any questions, continue to put that in the chat or jump in. All right, I see one question here, which I'll kick us off with while others come in. Um, how do you evaluate the ability of an AI technology to scale to meet different program needs? So, Catherine, do you want to jump in on your thoughts for that before I do?
Sure. I think, AI really isn't the gating factor for scalability. I think that's not an issue. Can AI scale? Yes, absolutely. What we're going through right now is the optimization process on the front end. So making sure that the output that we want is what comes out, right? So that the best quality possible, the best messaging aligned with what we're looking for. So we're spending a little bit of time on the front end optimizing so that every subsequent iteration or every subsequent CSR or every subsequent document generated is just a click and play, essentially. That's our goal. But scalability from AI is not a problem. That's what it's built for.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I'll say from our seat as a technology supporter here, a lot of it is where we've supported organizations. It's also, sharing what we have today, but sharing kind of our roadmap and ensuring that's aligned with how they're thinking about, scale at the enterprise level. Because I completely agree, technology is one piece of it. It may not be the gate. But there are ways that based on roadmap and based on team and sort of track record around continuing to build, we've been able to share, what scaling kind of looks like as we think on multiple, time horizons too. Great question. Next question I see here. What have you seen work best for getting writers to trust and adopt AI tools? Uh, Catherine, if you want to share your perspective, and then I can jump in with some of mine too.
Sure. I mean, I think from my perspective, it's simple. We actually didn't have medical writers in house, but I think bringing them on board from the beginning is what I think was critical in our project. We brought on the clinical sciences team, which, traditionally did the medical writing at my group, at my company. And it was critical to have them in the project from the beginning. So they felt a sense of, ownership, basically.
Yeah. For me, I think it's in general, how do you always build trust around something new? And Um, I remember someone told me, well, it just has to work. It has to work and it has to work consistently and repeatably. And I think what works best for getting writers to trust is to demonstrate that. That's why we actually believe pilots are a great tool because it starts to give exposure to the reality and demystifying, what AI can do and can't do, and starting to build that trust from a place of quality as well. So, we think that really comes down to kind of using it and building that experience and that AI fluency as well. Great question. All right, another question. If a team wants to move from pilot to production, what are the earliest signs that workflow and change management pieces are actually in place?
Yeah,
Catherine,
good
this
good
one?
question. I mean, we sort of did the same thing that we did with the medical writers is we brought in our IT group from the very beginning so that they were there to evaluate the vendors. They understood the process, they understood how this would fit in. And we actually didn't, start writing our SOPs before we implemented, a solution. Obviously, we did that after, but we had IT and our systems people along with us the whole way so that we could start thinking about how this was going to work. Um, I guess that's yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And some of the earliest signs I think we see from our seat is even the openness and the questions to saying what, almost sitting back down and redefining kind of roles and responsibilities, and saying, okay, what does my role actually look like after this? Where can I start to take things off my plate? Where do I start to shift into kind of more strategic parts of the job? So I think even an openness to have that conversation or do that exercise for us shows, like this is a good fit for kind of scaling and bringing in AI, in a wider way. And that you're open to having some of those kind of change management aspects. I'll say the other sign we see is that companies are across the board, our use case or not, investing in AI literacy. So just even bringing in tools like Copilot or ChatGPT or Claude just to say, hey, we want our team to just get comfortable with what AI can do is often a way to start bringing in kind of change management and like a shared language again.
Mm, that's a good point. Yeah.
Is that something for DMT it did as well, right?
Yeah, we're doing that as well. Yep, yep.
Yeah. All right, next question I see here. How easy was it to align stakeholders around sharing data and protocols with external vendors for AI training?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that wasn't much of an uphill battle for us because most of the vendors that we evaluated had, secure systems where we weren't worried about data leaking or integrity or anything like that. And then the other thing I'll say is most AI vendors also used a closed loop system where the agent does not have access to external sources of data, only your data. And so hallucinations don't happen. Things like that you're worried with using, Google, for example, is different. It's not going to happen in these AI systems. So I think from that perspective, we felt really comfortable with the vendors that we shared our data with.
Yeah, I think that's right. From our perspective here at Peer, we've invested a lot in our security, ensuring that we're SOC 2 compliant. But there's a note, the language that's used in this question is AI training. And we're very strict. Like we don't actually train on customer data. We learn from, relationships between data and content. Um, but ultimately, we're not training on that data itself. And I think that's a really important distinction when you're talking about sharing data and sharing this information. And I do think it is worth digging in with every, vendor to say, how deep do your security practices go? How does your architecture under the hood actually, use our information, learn, are you training? And it's a good place to bring in kind of your, IT experts to help with those conversations too. And I think many, vendors like us will at least be very transparent on how we've built our architecture as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Anita. I think it's important to make the distinction between AI training and then optimization of the
Yes,
output, right? Not the same.
100%. 100%. All right, one more question. You talked about how critical it is to have human in the loop. How do you decide which parts should stay human versus AI led? I think Catherine, you brought this into your
Mhm.
evaluation, so maybe you could start. I could share maybe too.
Yeah, sure. So, um, the agent is good at generating a first draft CSR, but that's sort of where we take the output and we bring in the human factor, essentially the reviews, the adjudication, alignment on key messaging, the small intricacies, like um, messaging is so important at the end of the day. And I think the refinement is where humans are really good at versus, the AI is maybe less good at. But we also, I guess one other point I'll say is in the beginning of the process, we're doing 100% QC on the data as well. But once we get comfortable that the data is always 100% accurate, we may reduce that QC step, right? Maybe we'll do only spot checks, or maybe we'll remove that step altogether to compress the timelines even further.
Absolutely. I agree with all of that. A couple notes. AI is only as good as the data it has, and kind of going back to that point of accumulated judgment. Some of that can be, captured in source data, and I think in our platform we capture that over continued usage over time. But there is a need to have, human experts in the loop because every document, every use case, there's a whole set of accumulated judgment that has to be applied here. Yeah, I can help with some of that. It can help with initial mapping of data, initial content generation, initial QC. But it is really important to have that strategic lens that will only come from an expert team as well. So we think we've thought a lot about that. And it's why we actually built the company with a whole, team of experts to sort of weigh in on where can we trust AI reliably and consistently from a quality perspective, and where and how do you have to have an expert in the loop. Um, there's a lot of discussion about human in the loop in this industry, and our view is actually not all loops are created equal, and it's actually really important to think about when an expert is involved and how, and being intentional about that as well. I was going to comment, Catherine, you talked about AI QC. I think that's, or sorry, human QC. I think that's spot on. When we started the company, even all of the content we were generating, we were doing 100% QC of our own content till we got to a place where we felt comfortable. And it kind of goes back to the point of trust. Once you start to see over and over and over, you feel comfortable around that. And I'll say it's very analogous to hiring someone new on your team and thinking about when do you QC what and kind of getting comfortable with that person. AI is, a peer. That's why we named the company the way we did, and I think it's that same kind of mental model.
Yep, no, that's a good point. And nothing is free from human error, right? It happens. It's normal. We're all humans. We make errors. This is one of the benefits I think of AI is the accuracy of the data is going to improve versus human written content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see more questions in here. Okay. Were any of the training data and documents in non-digital or handwritten formats? And did you face any challenges in handwritten documents when handwritten documents were used?
Yeah, maybe you should take that one.
Yeah, happy to. And I don't know if you had any other experiences. I think in the case where we were working with 4D Molecular Therapeutics, it was all in digital format. But I will say, sort of stepping back in our life at Peer, we have seen the whole range. We have seen scanned PDFs. We have seen some handwritten documents. Um, we've seen the full range. And I'll say overall, we've done a pretty good job in taking in the full range of types of data sources. PDFs, scanned PDFs, we've seen it all, and that's been pretty successful. The handwritten, there is a range on that, and it really depends. It's actually, we've been able to advance quite a bit on taking that in with a pretty high level of fidelity. It depends a little bit, and that's, from our perspective, it's a lot of what we do when we sort of set up a deployment with a customer is to ensure that we can consistently hit a level of quality in data ingestion and data processing as well. Because we know the reality is there are many documents that have been handwritten. But I'll take this question as an opportunity to add some fun types of sources we have used. We've done things like meeting recordings and voice notes in cases where we've written things like protocols, where a lot of the discussion and intention around driving things like protocols are really coming out of team meetings. And I think that's it really shows kind of the bounds of how you can start to think about what source data looks like for AI to start to apply and really go and be a little bit more creative on how you plug into kind of workflows as they exist.
That's really cool.
Awesome. Well, I'll pause if there's any other questions. I think we've hit the ones in the chat. There's any more that come in? All right. Well, first and foremost, I want to just thank Catherine again for joining me here at Peer and for sharing kind of your perspective, which I think is really mature given what we've seen in the industry. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you
Um,
for inviting me.
yeah, and thank you everyone for joining here. We'll make this recording available as well and appreciate the continued discussion.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye.